Hello, my name is Jason Peck, and this is a Comedy Q&A interview with Jamie Beckett. Jamie is currently a PhD student studying in the north of England. So by the time you watch this, he'll have graduated, and I'll have to reshoot this intro. Jamie is studying the use of humour in mystery plays and miracle plays, which were a popular form of entertainment in medieval times. And by that I mean the historical time period, not the American restaurant. So if this is a subject that interests you, please check out this interview. Thanks.
All right. So if it's okay with you, Jamie, I'd just like to jump right in. If you could just tell me just a little bit about your background and how you came to explore the relevance and function of humour and laughter within the late medieval period, because it's your PhD title, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it sounds so technical when you distill it into those words. But yeah, so my background is in medieval studies. I was really interested in urban medieval history. So everything about towns and cities, which kind of feeds into a rise in the late medieval period, which is probably from about the 14th to the 16th centuries, by my estimation. A rise in the kind of wealth and civic culture to do with merchants or artisans, so people who make things, people who are really involved in towns and cities and are less involved with the crown or with aristocratic elites or nobles. They're more into kind of lay, middling activities. So I was really interested in that period. I did my master's and my undergraduate degree at York, where they have still quite a active tradition of performing these mystery plays. Right. So I was involved with a group there of performers who staged the mystery plays in the gardens of the Abbey there, which have a kind of history of their own. But these plays are staged pretty much every 3 years on wagons, which is the traditional way of staging them. So the different groups have performed different stories of the Bible and progressed through the streets, kind of street theatre, people watching them, talking amongst themselves, seeing these things performed. Or in the modern day, we also have static performances, so in theatres and other spaces. And being involved with those groups, I was really interested in the humour of the pieces, so just how funny some of the episodes were and made to be. So I thought, well, if we're laughing at these so much now, how much were late medieval audiences laughing? Were they laughing at the same things? Got it. How important was that humour to them? And that kind of launched me into this project, which ended up in my doctoral thesis.
Wow. Yeah. It's one of those things where, I I took interest in when I was in, I guess after high school. So I had a friend a couple of years older than me. He got to university before I did. And he came back, he was like, Aristophanes. I was like, what are these words that you're saying to me? And that sort of took me down, a rabbit hole of, ancient Greek comedy and then Commedia dell'arte and Dario and all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, it was, for me, it was one of those things I was like, no one would be interested in me talking about this, but you took that fantastic step of going, I'm going to do this and I'm going to take it as far as humanly possible, which I think is great. And really, really, really interesting.
I think it's definitely humour or comedy or laughter are things which are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Everybody laughs. Everybody enjoys things, but they're now seen as less worthy objects of study. Yes, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense, because so much of the way we function as human beings and how we interact with each other is based on humour and being funny. Right. Why do we only have to look to tragedy or the more serious kinds of...
Right. There's always been an irritation, well, not an irritation because there are other things in life, but, it's one of those things where you kind of go, well, that's not for a serious conversation making people laugh. Let's talk about, these major tragedies. Yeah, and you just think, why? Because... laughter is an everyday thing that sort of greases the wheels of social interaction, Yeah. Maybe it's because, I don't know, I'm not a professor or anything, but maybe it's because laughter is such an immediate response. it works and it laughs, or it doesn't work and you don't get the laugh. It's kind of a little bit black and white, whereas tragedy, you can sort of sit there and ponder on it, and it affects you or it doesn't affect you in certain ways, then you applaud at the end. I don't know, maybe that's why.
I think there's a lot of value to that, but I think it has resulted in people thinking of humor as something quite superficial. It doesn't really matter. It's just something you laugh off and then dismiss. Whereas there is definitely more to it than that. I'm sure you agree.
Absolutely. Now, I just wanted to ask now from what I've looked, I mentioned to you previously that this area, the medieval period in general, and the mystery plays specifically, are just complete black hole of information for me. I don't know why. It was just maybe it's the misconception that the people of the time weren't that educated, but you've sort of indicated previously to me that that is a misconception that we generally have today. Now the medieval drama and the mystery plays and the miracle plays, they were mainly focused on representation of Bible stories, right? Things like the creation and Noah and Adam and Eve, that sort of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, so both kind of mystery plays and miracle plays are quite old-fashioned ways to describe these pieces of dramatic work.
Okay.
Mystery plays is a really... they were never referred to as mystery plays at the time. That's a kind of 19th century scholarly attribution, and it's based on this idea of mystères, which is a kind of old French word relating to crafts, and crafts, or these groups of or guilds of workers, are the ones who generally staged the plays which are most keenly associated with mystery plays. So that's kind of where the word mystery comes from. It's not really to do with all the mysteries of God or this kind of spiritual intake. It's more to do with the people who are performing these things. People still really dispute what to call them. They sometimes say biblical drama, but there's a problem in that as well, because the Bible isn't something which is necessarily a valid concept in this period. And that sounds really odd. We don't have in the 15th century a Bible that is written in English, in the vernacular, for everybody to read. We have a Latin Vulgate, which some people would have been able to read. We have people hearing about stories from family and friends. We have people being preached to and hearing about stories in that way. We have maybe excerpts of different Bible stories being brought up by different authors in other pieces of work, but we don't have that big, solid Bible that people can refer to when they're thinking about these things. So when we think about the Bible or biblical works in this period, especially when you're talking about popular audiences, so people who are from really different classes, men, women, anybody who was watching on the streets, we're talking about lots of different works and lots of different stories that were circulating at the same time, which don't necessarily line up that well with our Bible today.
Right. Okay. So a lot of it then was probably more, correct me if I'm wrong, because this is your area of study, not mine. So a lot of it would have been more sort of, almost like apocryphal stories, or how you should behave in society today.
Yeah.
Right? And so sometimes with a bit of Bible thrown in.
Yeah. It's very... You have to think of how they would have conceived of them. And it's quite difficult as a modern scholar or as a modern reader to think they would have really believed in this, or they would have really seen the authority in this thing. Because they are stories which don't really... always have solid foundations in biblical texts we recognize today, but at the same time they are stories which had authority, which were spoken about, which were circulated. So even if they're apocryphal to us, they wouldn't necessarily have been seen in the same way at that time. So we have lots of Bible stories that we'd recognize being changed slightly and being changed to specifically fit those audiences or those producers. So in the plays of, say, York, which is the city I mostly look at when looking to these mystery plays or kind of early biblical drama, we have characters saying things in a way which it seems very like other people who would have actually lived and worked in that town. We have performers who are acting in these performances who would be like butchers or tradesmen who would see day to day, so there'd be an association there. And we have characters putting themselves into situations which are recognizably biblical, but acting in ways which seem very contemporary, which seem very, to them, modern. Like speaking about current issues, speaking about kind of issues of gender, of power, of trade interests, all of these things which we don't really associate with biblical stories, but they kind of used as a way to talk about them.
Wow. Okay. All right. And they were you mentioned wagons, right?
Yeah.
And they were always performed on wagons?
No, so we know York is a really good example because we have surviving scripts of most of the plays in York as they would have been performed, as well as a lot of surviving documentation to say how they would have been performed. So payments to people who had come over to play God, or some other characters, notes of beer being provided for people creating like the sets, people being paid to make masks or make costumes. So we have all of those records, which allows us to speak about York with some confidence. And in York, so this big northern city, which was probably at this point the second largest city in the UK, England, we have wagons being used. So each of the different guilds who are producing these pageants, so individual plays within a big cycle of biblical plays, would have performed their own bit as it was dragged from point to point. You would have had different areas in the town where people would have gathered to sit to watch these performances, and they would have sat there all day, and the performances would have come past them, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. So you kind of get to sit there almost outside your house, or sometimes even from the window of your dwelling or whatever, and see all of biblical history being played out in front of you.
Wow. So it's kind of like sorry.
No, I was just saying the idea is you're kind of being immersed in the world of the Bible, and it's being mixed with your own world at the same time.
Right.
You can see it as a way to get closer to God, which was doubtless one of the utilities of the plays, but also as a way to kind of improve your understanding of human relationships and how all of those societies should work. So what you were saying about them being kind of telling you the right way to act or being moral works in that context, because they are enacting certain ways of behaving and not always behaving well. A lot of the comedy in these plays comes from characters misbehaving, and they misbehave so the audience can think to themselves, oh, how would I act in this situation? If I was placed in this biblical story, how would I?
Yeah.
So I went far away from your question then, though. We have in York, we have stages in a lot of other places. They're often called mansions, which sounds really fanciful, but we have lots of records of that. We have records of different types of wagons being used in England, in Scotland, on the continent, lots of different plays performed in lots of different ways, really.
Right.
There's a lot of variety in the performance culture of the period, but so little survives that it's sometimes quite difficult to pinpoint any real distinct way of staging. But we have for York, so we have taken it for read that this is a general way of performing these plays, and it's not necessarily. But that's why York is so useful, because we have all of this information about it.
Yeah, I see. What I was going to say was the idea I had was that it was sort of like, I'm not sure what it's like. You're in York right now, right?
No, I'm sadly away at the moment, but yes.
Okay.
So I've spent a lot of time there and in Durham, so slightly further north.
Got it. What I was going to say was in Chicago, a lot of the times they have sections of during the summer they have sections of the street cordoned off, and they often have like little local street fairs, and there would be a band at one end, and you could I imagine, I don't know because I haven't lived in the areas where that happens, but I imagine you could literally look outside your window and watch the band as it's playing, and then people are eating food and going to different vendors, that sort of thing. So it sort of sounds like it would have had a similar feel back then. You could almost look outside of your window and watch the play that is being performed.
Yeah. So a real festive atmosphere that lots of us have experienced. So
yes.
They were in York. They started at one end of town and kind of wound their way along a route through the heart of the city.
Yeah, so moving through. Got it. Okay.
They would have erected their own staging, and people would have made money by selling seats. People could have stood in the street as well to see these things. People could have stood at their windows and been invited by the people who lived in those houses to have a party in that room while watching the plays.
Wow.
There would be music, there would have been food, there would have been drink. It's a real festival atmosphere because this is a feast. The word festival obviously comes from the feast, and this is the Feast of Corpus Christi, which is one of the kind of bigger religious celebrations. But when you say religious celebration, it's not just about being pious and sensible and looking towards devotion. It's really celebrating and enjoying your way through these things.
Right. And that it's interesting you say that, because that's not the typical image that I have, from movies or TV shows or what have you. It's just sort of monks in brown and everything's dark and everything's grey, and you don't really get that sense of festivity or joy. You just get a sense of misery, I guess.
Yeah.
I think an unfortunate misconception, it seems.
Yeah, it's really fair to say that the medieval period, or even medievally feeling periods, I'm thinking Game of Thrones and things like that, so these fantasy series really focus on the dirt of the Middle Ages, the kind of downtrodden nature, the way that the powerful people were really only the church and the king or lords, that you really had to fear for your life, and that there was a lot of violence and bloodshed. And whereas those things are partially true, we also have real interesting instances of a kind of real fun in culture, a willingness to play, a willingness to perform, a real desire to celebrate different things, and also with this burgeoning middling sort, as I've talked about, so the people who are making more money from trade and from different aspects of manufacturing, we get more people with more money wanting to celebrate their own culture and their spin on things. It's the period I'm working on is really the ones just before people start talking about the Renaissance, which itself is a bit of a problematic term, but I won't bore you with that.
maybe another time.
And maybe another time. But we get this really exciting culture where people have money to do things, and they're really willing to put it out there and enjoy it.
Right. And though you were saying there were scripts left behind, roughly, but we don't really know. Were they like complete scripts, or were they sort of outlines and detail of what would happen in the story?
Yeah, so I think it's always worth saying it's easy to talk about York. I will mention York till we're done. In York, we have a relatively broad surviving set of scripts. So we have the creation, we have Adam and Eve, we have lots of plays in between. We have passion plays to do with Christ and the crucifixion, and we have the Last Judgment, so the kind of this apocalyptic scene at the end. So we almost have a full script of what happened. The reason this is recorded is because in the 1470s, so this is probably about a century or something like that into the history of the plays, they would have been performed quite regularly before then, almost yearly at points. The government of York, so the kind of civic council and the aldermen there, wanted to have a bit of control over these performances. So they decided to record them or ask the groups who were performing them to submit scripts. And from this point on, somebody from the council would go and be paid to sit in and make sure that all of the right words were being said, so you couldn't sneak anything unauthorized in.
Got it.
So that's the reason why the scripts do survive in York. because the civic government wanted this sense of control. In lots of other places, they don't survive. They don't survive either because nobody ever bothered to write them down, because the performances would have been known by heart by some people,
right,
or because the scripts that were written would have been written on kind of scraps of paper that were discarded really quickly, burnt or thrown away. We also have the problem, which you always have with the Middle Ages, where things just don't survive as well, especially if they're paper, if they're parchment, if it's a record which nobody has bothered to treasure and cherish, maybe because it's become unfashionable, which the place did become because of various things, but because of the Reformation as much as anything else. People started thinking they were a bit too Catholic or a bit too popish, so they wanted to discard these plays. So we don't have them survive in lots of the places where they were performed. But we have the York Cycle, which is quite a full collection of plays, which is housed in the British Library in something called the York Register. We have the Townley plays, which used to be associated with Wakefield in Yorkshire, but aren't really anymore as much. They're associated with that area, but not the particular town. So that survives in the Huntington Library in California. And then we have other scripts. So we have scripts from Chester. We have scripts known as the N-Town Collection, which are thought to come from East Anglia, which is another region that was very wealthy at this period, full of quite exciting mercantile cultural events. So we really have a limited number of the things that were actually performed, but it's a kind of tantalizing touch of what was happening at this period.
Right. And so that means we also wouldn't have any, certainly in England, we wouldn't have had any specific playwrights that we wouldn't have known, right?
No, not really. And it's always difficult to say because, tomorrow somebody could discover something.
Right. Yeah.
Find a name at the bottom of a manuscript. But most of the texts we're dealing with are anonymous. And most of that is because there was less of a stress put on who actually wrote down these plays at this point. And of course, we don't know if the person who was writing these things down actually conceived of the scripts at all. In the case of York, they probably didn't.
Yes.
It's most community theatre. It's partially improvised all the time. They would have been reacting to audiences. They would have been thinking, how can we best tell this story?
Right.
So it's the idea of authorship is quite a difficult one and quite a modern one. But saying that in other places on the continent, in the Low Countries, we have authors of similar plays. So we talked briefly before about the rhetoricians' guilds, which were a big thing in the Low Countries, and they were performing similar kinds of plays, not always biblical in theme, but quite famous playwrights of those whose names survive. But in England, less so, and we're not really sure why. But in a sense, it's the same as works of art. The idea that artists don't really exist in that period until this Renaissance, when suddenly we get everybody's name being written down. It's because the artist isn't necessarily seen as important as what they've actually produced.
Right. And what you were describing, how sort of semi-improvisational, it sort of sounds a little bit like I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Comedy QnA period. That was sort of outline, a lot of outlines. Everyone would have their part, but the dialogue essentially would be improvised, or you'd insert stock bits of script that you had previously memorized. Or it's like a little bit more like modern day stand-up, certainly with the interactions with the audience and responding to the feedback you're getting.
Yeah, I think stand-up is a really good comparison because you are following a internalized script to some extent.
Yes.
You really are working with the crowd you have, and these performances could change quite wildly between the ways they're being staged, though of course we have a kind of authoritative version which has survived. So it's more difficult to align them with the Commedia dell'arte tradition because that is so in itself so interesting and so distinct. we don't just see in these biblical plays certain types being performed or certain bits of script. We see definite stories because they're the stories of the Bible.
Right.
It's just slight changes in the way they're being performed, and
right.
which that's the character you're stressing.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified slight change in the way where they're performed as opposed to the content, because I can't imagine an Adam and Eve story where they don't get kicked out of the Garden of Eden.
Well,
exactly. Reacting to what the audience want. Oh, you don't. Oh, you want them to stay. Okay, well they're staying now. They've expelled the snake.
Yeah, very much. So you have to hit those points, but.
Right.
You can really compare that to modern performances where you have your points to hit, otherwise you don't get anywhere in a certain performance.
Right.
So, yeah. And when you're telling the story of the Bible, you have to be, fairly consistent. You have things that people will expect, so can't deviate too much from those.
And so on that then, my impression of, probably the period itself and of, sort of, my impression of the Bible, perhaps in that time period, it seems very dry and very serious. But you're looking at the humor. So, the mystery plays then used a lot of humor. Were they like comedic vehicles, or were they more sort of dramatic and fair with moments of comic relief?
Right. So it's important to say that the mystery plays were usually performances of the whole of biblical history. So if you have that structure to work with anyway, so then they're not really comedy vehicles, because the primary object of performing them isn't just to make people laugh, even though that's a good thing to do on its own, don't get me wrong. Yeah. It is more to show the stories of the Bible, to help people understand them. But a lot of what I talk about in my research concerns how humor is used for people to approach those stories. So how, especially the way comic elements are not only just a relief to performances, kind of measured against the tragic ones, but really open out these stories of the biblical past and allow people to get closer to them. So the way we talked about the whole of this festival transform streets into these biblical spaces, you can see humor as a way to really bring people in, because laughter itself is ubiquitous. Humor has always been part of human interaction. It's a kind of quite natural thing. So to have comic elements in these performances doesn't just mean that people will be laughing at them and kind of maintaining their attention through that. It's also as a way to get them to interact with the ideas that are going on here. Right. And we'll definitely see that. So the play of Noah's Ark is quite a common one. We see that in York, where Noah is seen as a kind of a righteous man. He's building the ark. He's the last righteous man on the earth. He saves his family. He does all of the things that the Bible, as we read now, says he does. But we also see him as a character treated quite comically. He's usually portrayed as a silly old man, certainly before he learns how to build the ark.
Yes.
Who's asleep. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He learns under God's tutelage how to do all of this work. Yeah. Then also in those stories, quite famously, we see Noah's wife being introduced. And Noah's wife isn't really in the biblical account, but here she is given a huge role, certainly in York, in Townley, in Chester, in some of the other play cycles that exist. Or, sorry, I shouldn't say play cycles. Plays that exist.
I'll forgive you.
Please forgive me. Yeah. But we see this new relationship between Noah and his wife. Okay. And it's really difficult to think of reasons why that would be, except for to appeal to the audience, who are mostly married people who are kind of working with this performance structure that is based on people who would get married rather than the clergy who wouldn't. And we see it as a comic relationship. They're bickering at each other constantly. Okay. They're fighting at one point. Noah's wife refuses stoutly to get onto the ark, calling her husband mad, like swearing at him. It's really their comic confrontation which forms a different center to the play than one we might imagine as modern audiences. And you have to think about why that is, why they've bothered to make this funny, whereas they could have just kept it perfectly straight. They could have just performed the Bible, as a serious, piece of doctrine, really. So why humour is being used, I think, to help people understand exactly what the ramifications were and what they'd do in the situation if their husband came home and told them that the world was flooding, so you have to board an ark now and we leave everything behind.
Right.
It's really thinking about those big questions, but in a comic way, without really, without being angry, without raising the ire of people, but allowing them to think about those big issues rather than just glossing over them as they might do otherwise.
Right. It's interesting because I've just suddenly thought that, they Hollywood made that movie Evan Almighty a few years ago, right?
Right.
And that was sort of essentially a retread of the idea of Noah's Ark, essentially, and it was and exploring the comic implications around that. But it's interesting that that's something that has been around for a long time now.
Yeah, and it's really a way to make those stories or make those narratives more human, I think.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily bring them down to a level, because I don't think comedy ever really brings things down in that sense. It makes us interact with them as the people who are already listening, who are already their audiences. So it's a really interesting way to look at a topic.
Right.
It gets you possibly further than it would just to tell you a story and expect you to understand it.
Okay. Now, I read an article that you wrote in 2017, using your words against you now.
No.
You made reference to some of the mystery plays using puns. So I wanted to ask you, do we have an idea of the type of humor that they used? Was it just puns? Were there any other techniques that they used?
Well, you put me on the spot quoting my own words at me.
I'm sorry.
I don't even remember the puns they use. But
sorry.
We see, I'd say, more situational comedy. You can, in that they're dealing with human relationships, and they're kind of, most of the humor derives from characters clashing, and I've argued elsewhere that most of it comes from this slight clash between the lived experiences as audiences would have had them, or as spectators will have felt them, with this idea of the biblical past. So to come back to Noah and the Ark, you have somebody who's kind of a normal woman day to day. She works, she's got children, she kind of deals with a troublesome husband who's a bit stupid. You have that figure who seems quite normal and quite natural to us, confronted with this biblical paradigm of the great flood and everybody dying and the world being removed and this patriarch Noah. So it's those things rubbing up against each other, those kind of frames of understanding clashing, which create all of the humor within them. We do have puns, we have a lot of bawdiness, there's a lot of swearing, which sometimes surprises people because these are biblical plays.
Right,
yeah, we do have swearing quite a lot. Noah's wife famously calls Noah Ramskite, which is kind of means ram poo.
Okay.
We have lots of different aspects of physical comedy. So there's sparring on set. There are people kind of literally fighting, tripping each other over, scrappling into things. But we also have a lot of quite sophisticated humor, which is more playing on the audience's expectations of how somebody might act, or they're laughing at a situation they recognize, but one that's slightly different to what they might expect.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think it's quite broad, but we have, I think people usually have an idea of medieval humor being something to do with the body and with scatological stuff, and being to do with everything that we see kind of in film or TV representing the medieval past. And there was a lot of that. You read Chaucer, you see really like funny, bawdy episodes, and that's a really big part of medieval comic culture. But there is quite a lot more to it than that as well. There's a depth there which I think is often kind of appreciated.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I was thinking, I was speaking to someone the topic of Shakespeare, and I was talking about this is something I learned from when I was at college, that a lot of Shakespeare still works today because we still experience a lot of the same situations, the same emotions. The language has changed, but we as people haven't really changed that much. And now you're telling me it's kind of the same with humor, where we still joke about the same sort of things. The language is different, and our understanding of things, our bodies and that sort of thing is different and is more informed. But essentially, we're still making the same dick jokes and same insults and using we're swearing and all that sort of stuff. The expletives have changed, but fundamentally, things haven't changed that much.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But I think you have to moderate it to a certain extent because we're laughing about different things, and there are some things now which are. Well, I suppose you could argue about this, but some things that are a medieval spectator probably would have found funny, which we don't really accept. So there's a lot of misogynistic stuff. There's a lot of anti-Semitic stuff, especially in English theatre. These are to do with stock characters as much as anything else. So you can, to some extent, distance from that in modern performances, but I think getting back to the text and the culture is always important. So even though we're laughing in similar ways at similar kind of forms, it's the details of those forms which really count sometimes.
Right.
And it's what's kind of most interesting in research when you come on something which a medieval audience might have found really funny, but trying to work out how or why that might be. So the kind of the really different culture which feeds into these narratives of humor that are circulating, these discourses of humor, you could say, how estranged that is from our experience and how it can be sometimes difficult to understand. I think there are certain plays in the mystery plays, so the kind of biblical plays I look at, which laugh at subjects which would almost be difficult to touch at this point, and to kind of remove away from the subjects of misogyny and anti-Semitism, we get performances like that involving the Virgin Mary. There's a major set of narratives and performances surrounding Joseph, so Joseph the carpenter, doubting that Mary is a virgin. Today seems very odd. It seems very unnatural to us. It seems almost, it seems blasphemous, but it was definitely something which was performed. We have Joseph repeatedly asking who Mary slept with, that she had been duped into this by somebody dressed as an angel, and that is made comic, and that's a comic situation. That has basis in earlier works of church fathers. So there's a work called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which I wouldn't ever recommend pronouncing, and I'm even now unsure that I pronounced it right myself. But here we see...
I'm sure I'll get lots of emails and lots of comments. Hey, here...
All the correspondence. It's a gift to you. But we do see that being formed as a story, that Joseph doubted the Virgin Mary's story of this, and was quite soon rectified. But when it's taken into performance, that story of doubt is made quite a comic thing. And it's sometimes not necessarily clear whether we're laughing at Joseph for being stupid enough to think that this woman isn't the Virgin Mary, or whether we're laughing at the Virgin Mary because it sounds very much like she's been duped. It almost puts us into the world of the biblical time, and whatever time that is, and gets us to think, how would we react to this situation? Of course, we know what has happening. There's no doubt in the minds of the people watching that the Virgin Mary is a virgin. But the comic situation arises from people playing with those doubts, kind of really daring the audience to think about this stuff in a way that they wouldn't have thought of before, which to us now seems unthinkable. If you're thinking of pious medieval people, you don't think, oh, there's a whole series of performances, a series of artworks, manuscripts, which play on this idea of Joseph not believing in Mary's virginity.
Interesting. just to sort of stick with the idea, I mean, I wanted to go off on a tangent there, but I'm trying to be conscious of time, and it would take us into a serious rabbit hole. So with the restagings of the mystery plays, which I'm sure you've seen, right, as what you've been involved with and seen, does the humor still work? I mean, do they? I've sort of covered that part where they use the same jokes that we sort of do today. They sort of hit upon the same subjects. Do they still work? And they were essentially packaged in a different way with the language. Do we have to? Do they work? Does the humor work using the language with the English language as we know it now, or do we have to use their English language?
I think it always depends what you want to do with a performance, because there are so many ways of performing any play, really, aren't there? If you're not sticking quite rigidly to this. I think there's a lot of potential for humour, and certainly a lot of performances I've seen people have laughed at densely, because so many of the comic elements are situation based. So people always laugh at this relationship between Noah and his wife because it speaks to modern relationships to some extent. You're playing on the same meeting of two worlds. You're laughing at a bickering couple. You're laughing at the way that they just don't understand each other, and that's a fairly easy thing for modern audiences to grasp. I'd say it can work in performances of Middle English versions. It definitely can, because people have performed it in that way. But I think because those plays rely so much on this meeting of a kind of idea of a biblical time and the idea of a contemporary time, you can also stage them in a modern way, which plays on modern values, which achieves a very similar result. I think what makes things more difficult in raising a laugh now to some of these plays, is the fact that people don't have the same knowledge of different aspects of the Christian story, of kind of biblical life. They won't necessarily understand a reference to something. So when I've previously written on Noah and the fact that in modern scholarship, most people see him just as this righteous man. He's purely a righteous man. He builds an ark, and he's the last righteous man on earth, and that's why he does it. But in the late Middle Ages, there's a lot more focus put on the story which happens after Noah disembarks, essentially, when he grows vines. He becomes the first person to grow wine and drinks too much and gets drunk and makes a fool of himself. This is a really big story. It's well known in the late medieval period, the medieval period more generally, and far later. And because of this, I've argued before that audiences would have probably been a bit more ready to laugh at him, because he's already been seen to be a slightly ridiculous figure. Whereas to a modern audience, they have really, unless they are really well read up on certain pieces of the Bible or different aspects of that culture, they don't have any idea, and they have different expectations of certain characters. So when those expectations are being played with, people can't really appreciate it in the same way. I think, again, there are things that modern audiences don't really laugh at that medieval ones would have laughed at for possibly good reason, depending on your sensibilities. But but when you are staging things, I think it's really up to the performers to really engage with that spirit which medieval performers would have had, interacting with an audience, really trying to read the crowd and work out what it is that will make them laugh or respond in the way they want to these things. So yes, they are funny. They are funny plays. They can be made to be funny, but as with every performance of something which has comic overtones, it really depends on how well it's being acted and how well you're working the crowd and doing those things.
Got it. Okay. So I just want to get into just wrapping up now, if that's all right. My final question to you is this: knowing what you know about how humor is used in the mystery plays, its function in the history plays. Mystery plays, not history. This is going really well. I'll take this again. Knowing what you know about how humour and laughter is used in the mystery plays, do you think there are any lessons that modern comedy or modern comedians can learn from them?
I think it's always difficult because I think I would say that the plays are at the cutting edge of a culture which is, for its time, very sophisticated. And I think they are clever, they're trying to be clever, they're trying to play with people's expectations, which are things we see in modern comedy all the time.
Yes.
It's especially, comedians you see as being very good or very skilled are constantly playing with what the audience expect them to do, and then either changing that slightly or completely subverting it, which is something we definitely see in these plays. I wouldn't like to recommend or give any tips based on them. They're so rooted in the historical moment,
right,
that it almost seems odd to make those links. But I think definitely this idea of reading a crowd, working with what you've got, really trying to apply the material in a way which draws out people to think about things, to really work out where they lay with reference to the material you're working with, I think is valuable in modern ideas of comedy.
Right. Yeah, I think that something like that would be easier in terms of doing stand-up or sketch comedy or an improv, and less so in like an established play, because you have to often, with something like Noel Coward that leaps to mind, or Oscar Wilde, you've got the given circumstances, and I think it would be difficult to sort of change your performance. I don't know. It could be difficult to change your performance based on audience reaction, because you don't want to, everyone's expecting the certain things to happen, within that everyone's familiar with.
But I suppose you can always argue that you don't want an audience to always be expecting things. You don't want it to be tired or stale. You always want to put your own spin on it to make it that bit funnier, that slight revelation which comes with the best comedy. Makes you think, oh, actually, you've surprised me there, because it's even, and I remember this to be before. Right,
and you're just sort of saying that. I forget the character's name. This is really bad. But there's a character in the Oscar Wilde play, Importance of Being Earnest. The Lady Bracknell. There we go. Whew.
Yeah.
But she has a line where she says handbag, because John Worthing's talking about how he was found in a handbag, and there's a famous one in the movie from the 50s, I think, or 60s, how she says, I forget the actress's name, which is really bad. But
Margaret Rutherford? Is that?
Yes,
that
there you go. Thank you. Saved. But perhaps then you're going to a new production of The Importance of Being Earnest, knowing this, and then wondering how the actor that you're watching is going to deliver that line.
Yeah, and you're playing with those really familiar characters sometimes, but making them better. Putting your own spin on things.
Yeah.
Is always valued. Yeah. But that's a really good comparison. Yeah.
and then it would also be similar with Shakespeare as well, wouldn't it? There's a bigger example there. How is Hamlet going to do his to be or not to be speech?
Yeah. How is Falstaff going to be performed? How are you going to do kind of his comedy?
Because I've seen this play 9 times and it's been different every time. And are you going to be better? And am I going to be surprised? Right?
And I think it's also worth saying that the mystery plays kind of really get their material from a very broad, well-known culture. So people watching them would have shared the kinds of knowledge they had to approach these things, which I think is it's an interesting in relation to more modern comedy, because everything is to some extent so specialized now, or everything which we see as really quite good comedy relies on a kind of niche, relies on certain people being interested or knowing about this kind of material. So it almost compares better to very broad sitcom comedy, which is family friendly, even though we obviously see a lot of swearing, a lot of different things in these plays, because it is trying to work with a very broad group of different kinds of people, all having different levels of education and knowledge and interest. So I think that's also a kind of an interesting way to think about them in terms of modernity.
Right. Fantastic. So where can we? I mean, you've got your PhD. You passed your, how you pronounce it, Viva.
Yeah.
So you passed that, and so you've got your dissertation, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to happen? Are you aiming to get that published?
Yeah, we'll see, because I only passed the Viva a week ago, so it's early stages yet. But yeah, I think probably in the future that will be coming out. All of the work I've done so far has been with the Records of Early English Drama Northeast Project, which is based at the University of Durham, and they have a really good blog if you want to look at any of the material that either I've spoken about or different members of the team have spoken about, which doesn't necessarily relate to comedy, which is still good. I'm also part of something called the Humours of the Past Network.
That's where I found that article you wrote.
Oh, yes, which is a really great working group of scholars who are dealing with different aspects of humour throughout history. Yeah. So I really advise anybody watching to look at that blog as well, because there's, whether you want to look at medieval comedy, classical comedy, anything from 200 BC up to anywhere in the present time. There's some really great stuff, and it's so interesting that everybody is interested in comedy not only as something superficial to make you laugh briefly, but as something worthy of study of the human experience.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's it. I mean, thank you again so much for your time and your patience, certainly with my technical issues I had earlier on.
My voice because I think there's long left in it.
But I really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge here. It's been fantastic. It's been really eye-opening.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and I hope it might enthuse you to look at some of the plays a bit, because I know a lot of these plays are restaged quite often in the States. So university productions, but they're quite funny. So yeah. Okay. It's lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, you too, Jamie. I really appreciate it. And let me know, stay in touch and let me know what happens with your dissertation and, what happens with that and if it gets published. I mean, if it does, I'll be getting a copy.
I thank you very much.
That's one sale. No pressure.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe in a couple of years. Yeah,
okay. Maybe. All right. Well, thank you very much again. I really appreciate your time and thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem at all. Right. See ya.